There were a few of you who put your hands up before and said you were here on that time a few years ago, 21 years. So nostalgia might be a little bit easy. I'll have a wee bit of nostalgia at the beginning and then move on to some more directly relevant comments on the reading from Isaiah and the week ahead of us. So what I do remember from the nostalgia bit is there's a row of Māori people over there. Joe Hawke from Ngāti Whātua amongst them, and Moana Maniapoto sang a song. Now, I don't know whether you can remember it, but it's a Jimmy Cliff song. And he just, Moana just did the waiata for Nelson's kōrero to us. And I can't sing it as well as Moana Maniapoto will do. She was just been inducted to the New Zealand Music Hall of Fame last month, and said some very nice words about me and the New Zealand Listener as well. Apparently I inspired some of her activism, which is good. So this was the song from Jimmy Cliff. If the rebel in me can touch the rebel in you, and the rebel in you can touch the rebel in me, and the rebels we be is gonna set us free. And then the next one, if the lover in you can touch the lover in me, and the lover in me can touch the lover in you, and the lover we be will bring sweet harmony. So bring out the love, bring out the love, bring out the love to me. But I mean, she sang it much better. I offer the thought that we don't normally associate rebel and lover together. Just as the reading from Isaiah has the wolf and the lamb feeding together, and the lion eating straw like the ox. So that's the sort of the theme for today. The rebel and the lover, the wolf and the lamb, the lion eating straw with the ox. And they are important contrasts, obviously. We don't always see the world in binaries, and neither should we. But these are binaries, and what do we make of them? Chapter 65 of the book of Isaiah is said by those who study these things to be Trito Isaiah, or third Isaiah, and speaks of the coming of a new age. The imagery is similar to the imagery of the New Testament book of Revelation, especially in chapter 26. So it's end time stuff, eschatology, words like that. The disciples of Jesus rather expected the new age to come quite soon, but they died, and another generation died, and another generation died, and we're still being born and dying, and the end times don't seem to have quite arrived just yet. Mind you, I don't know what you think, but maybe the election of President Trump and the death of Leonard Cohen are signs of the end times. It certainly is for music, for me, because Leonard Cohen was a man whose concerts I went to, paid quite a lot of money to enjoy on more than one occasion. But I suspect probably the new age has not yet dawned, and we have to wait a little while. But whilst we wait, we don't just do nothing. And so that's why it's quite important to focus on how Nelson Mandela's life and achievements relate to the hugely difficult issues we face now in 2016. Not quite the same issues as we faced 21 years ago, but the sort of issues that we need to struggle with, and for which there may not be one correct answer. But certainly it needs to be said, because the lovely Rainbow Nation gentleman who was the president of South Africa in the 1990s is someone whom people find it quite easy to love. But Comrade Mandela was a rebel. He was a rebel. Indeed, he was a terrorist for some. Many nations had his name and the name of the African National Congress on their list of terrorist organisations. He played a pivotal role in the movement of the African National Congress from its 50 years of adherence to completely non-violent opposition to apartheid, to including armed struggle as one of the options in the struggle to end apartheid. The leader of the ANC at the time was Chief Albert Lutuli, and he had won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1960 for the work of the ANC to seek to bring about peaceful change in South Africa. But the very next year, in 1961, it was the young man Nelson Mandela who successfully moved at the ANC conference that year that there should be formed Umkhonto weSizwe, the spear of the nation, the armed struggle arm of the African National Congress. And one of his comrades was Comrade Joe Slovo, the member of the South African Communist Party. So it's not hard to see why some people would have called him a terrorist, and why certainly the state authorities in South Africa hunted him down, put him on trial, contemplated executing him, but decided, thank goodness, to send him and many others of the African National Congress to prison for what turned out to be a very long time. I had to struggle with these issues about whether armed struggle was an appropriate response to the iniquities of apartheid in South Africa, because I, for some years, lived in Tanzania in East Africa at the time when many ANC exiles were also living there, and at a time when Frelimo, the Front for the Liberation of Mozambique, was engaged in an armed struggle against the Portuguese imperial domination of their country, Mozambique. And I had to struggle with that because when I was a young man, I had registered myself as a conscientious objector if I should happen to be called up, but my birthday didn't come up and I never had to answer questions about that. And here I was supporting the ANC Solomon Mahlangu School in Morogoro in Tanzania, where young men were being educated but also indoctrinated in the idea of armed struggle as well. And I found myself giving my own blood to the Frelimo organisation to assist those who were wounded in the struggle. So I had to argue with myself, and I continue to argue with myself. Some years I think I'm a pacifist, and other years I think I'm not. And it depends on what the causes are that seem to be here at the time. And I don't know whether others of you have that same struggle, but if you don't, I invite you to have it, and if you do, I invite you to continue to struggle with these sorts of issues. Because I supported the ANC and Frelimo and other liberation movements whose headquarters were based in Dar es Salaam in Tanzania at that time, I answered a question very recently when I applied for a visa to the United Kingdom. I want to stay there for more than 6 months. I need to apply for a visa to stay beyond that 6 months. And there's a question there that said, have you ever advocated terrorism? And to the consternation of my wife, I ticked yes. She said, I want to go to England, and I can't go if you're not coming, because after all, you're the visitor at Oxford College, and we've got to go together. And I said, well, I explained it very clearly. I said, in the view of some people, those who believed in a non-racial democracy in South Africa, who believed in the democratic right of all the peoples of South Africa to vote for a government of their choice, that was defined by some people as terrorism, not by me. But seeing that you asked whether I had advocated terrorism, I did advocate the policies of non-racial democratic South Africa. Well, I got my visa, so I can go to England for more than 6 months next year, and that's an instance to show, I suppose, that honesty is usually the best option, and whether I find that still so when I arrive at Heathrow Airport, we'll have to find out. But there we are. So the comrade Nelson Mandela, who was convicted of various crimes and sent to long terms of imprisonment, when he went to Robben Island off the coast of Cape Town, he was indeed a rebel. In terms of Isaiah, I think he was definitely in the wolf and lion categories, rather than the lamb and the ox. When he emerged after 27 years in prison, 18 years of which were spent in that one cell on Robben Island, he had chosen a different path. I visited that cell. It's not very big, and gives you plenty of time for contemplation, because they let the prisoners out on work party for very short periods of the day, but most of their time was spent in those single cells. And after 18 years in that cell and some other more years of prison while some secret negotiations went on, Nelson Mandela emerged from prison with a different path that he had chosen, not the path that he had argued for at the time of his convictions. He wanted truth, yes, but also reconciliation. And the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was set up. For Nelson Mandela, after his release from prison and the process towards a democratic election in South Africa, for Mandela, the wolf and the lamb could, should, and must feed together. And he went to huge efforts to show that visibly. He went to visit Mrs. Verwoerd. Mrs. Verwoerd was the widow of the President Verwoerd, who had been the most staunch National Party advocate and implementer of the apartheid system in some of its earlier years. President Mandela had the effrontery to wear the symbol of white supremacist sporting prowess, the Springbok rugby jersey, with number 9 on the back, to encourage the South African team to beat the All Blacks in the World Cup final. A famous occasion in New Zealand history, one that we reflect on occasionally when the All Blacks do get beaten. But there was Mandela wearing a jersey which most people associated with the oppressor. And he said, let's not go down that binary. When he had his inauguration ceremony, he had standing very close by him the warder in Robben Island who had locked him up all those many years. He was personally invited to be present to see his prisoner inaugurated as the President of free and democratic South Africa. As President, and in the years after his presidency, he was an old man, but he did not slow down much. He devoted huge energies to alternatives to war. Rather than the armed struggle that he'd advocated as a young man, he saw perhaps that there must be alternatives, and if there are, we must use them as our first choice. If there are threats to peace and security, is war the immediate response when something awful happens in the world? He was by now the ex-president of South Africa when the war drums were beating for what became the invasion of Iraq in 2003. He worked with Kofi Annan, the Ghanaian man who was Secretary General of the United Nations, to seek alternatives to invasion. Indeed, he thought that he should put himself there in Baghdad, and he got permission from Kofi Annan. The plane was organised at Johannesburg Airport. President Thabo Mbeki said, yes, you can go, but by the time the yes had come from President Mbeki, shock and awe bombings had already started, so the plane didn't leave, and he was not able to put himself in that position of saying, let's try, surely there must be better ways than shock and awe bombings. So that was the sort of action that he took after he was the president. And out of that particular experience arose a group called the Elders, and they continue. These are people who have held high office in the various nations and international institutions of our world. And they give themselves the job of being people who bother those who are now in power. They say, yes, we know what it's like to be in power, to have to exercise hard choices, and so we want to come along and talk to you about some of the issues that are happening in your nation right now. And I had the privilege of hearing a group of elders speak in Oxford in 2014. Amongst those there was Kofi Annan, by now the former Secretary General of the United Nations, Mary Robinson, former President of Ireland, Jimmy Carter, former President of the United States of America, and some other people who were talking about issues that the elders had engaged in the last year or so. In particular, the transition to democracy in Myanmar, some of the issues in South Sudan, and the reconciliation processes in Rwanda, and the roles of women in bringing about peace in each of those three nations. Now, just to put you slightly off guard, these initiatives by the elders are funded in a very quiet and private way by a man called Richard Branson. And Virgin Airlines and Virgin Empire may not be your cup of tea, but there he is. He never puts his name on anything, but he is the man that has been funding these elders to support the initiatives that Nelson Mandela asked of him. And so they continue to meet and do their work. So it is pretty clear that this man, where is he? There, wearing that gorgeous shirt. I wear shirts like that and my wife says, they're so gaudy. And I say, they're beautiful. We've all got different tastes, haven't we? What he, I'm sure, would ask of us is to think about this coming week in Auckland is what is our response around the world to issues of war and peace? And what is the most obvious and first response to violence and terrorism? Should it be war? Well, Nelson Mandela, in his old age, most certainly would have given a clear answer, no. We must always seek for other alternatives, and if war does happen, we must put in place as soon as possible the networks to create peace afterwards, because wars don't go on forever, and peace has to break out sometime, and there need to be people to bring other people together in the aftermath of war. So, how would he respond to the issues that we have in this city in this coming week? It's the 75th anniversary of the Royal New Zealand Navy. There will be sailors in town. Everyone likes a sailor in a uniform, don't they? There's a former sailor down there. Where's your uniform, Pat? There are sailors in town from apparently up to 30 nations. As I walked up Queen Street this morning, I noticed that there's a tavern in town that's offering quite reasonably priced tots of rum for what it calls the Defence Forces Special for the week in that particular tavern. We could perhaps celebrate the fact that New Zealand's nuclear-free warships policy stands and remains in place. That's what Nicky Hager has said, and many people think of Nicky Hager as out on the extremes, but he has said we shouldn't be opposing the United States warship coming, we should welcome them because they're coming on our terms. And that effort in the 1980s has borne fruit, and now we are welcoming people from 30 nations who are all complying with New Zealand's nuclear-free legislation. On the other hand, there are other people who normally admire Nicky Hager who disagree with him. And they say, we don't think that there should be a New Zealand Defence Industry Association fair where a number of companies are advertising the type of equipment that facilitates wars to take place in different parts of the world. So there is the New Zealand Defence Industry Association meeting. There's also the Auckland Peace Action protests that are taking place. There's a talk by Dr. Helen Caldecott at AUT on Tuesday. She is the Australian doctor who had such a big influence on New Zealand public opinion in the 1980s. and has dedicated her life to speaking about the global arms trade and how inappropriate it is. If that's not enough for you, next Friday, there's something on Monday as well. Some of you are going to, isn't there? What was that one? You're going to make that in the announcements. All right. On Friday, there's Dr. Jenny Tapar, formerly Principal of Te Raukahukatia at St John's College, speaking on just war in the Selwyn Library. And then, if you're keen, you can hear Margaret Bedggood and others have a day of reflection in the cathedral on the just war doctrine. All of these events of next week, I think, invite us all to think about the just war doctrine, because it's a Christian doctrine, put in place by people like St. Augustine of Hippo and St. Thomas Aquinas, for whom it was a doctrine of self-defense, and for self-defense only. Whether that's still an appropriate doctrine for the church of and all churches or people of Christian faith is a matter which has been debated this year, and I'm sure that Nelson Mandela would have encouraged that debate. The Catholic Pontifical Council for Justice and Peace met in Rome in April this year and came to the conclusion that it would be better to replace the just war doctrine with a just peace doctrine. And Pope Francis has urged the Pontifical Council to proceed with their work towards such thinking and theological reflections. Well, whether to join in or not in any of these options available to you next week is the sort of truth and reconciliation work that I believe Nelson Mandela would have invited us to inquire into. And there may be more than one right answer. Just as in Nelson Mandela's life, there was more than one right answer, and his own life journey, his opinions changed. If we're not open to have our own opinions changed, we probably need to have prophet Isaiah read to us again. If all this seems too difficult and you want to get out of Auckland and get away from it all and reflect and pray, I will put another hat on, and that is that I'm the chair of the St Isaac's Retreat House Trust in Opunoni in the Hokianga. And may I commend to you some retreat time at St Isaac's Retreat House in the Hokianga. It's a place of quiet and beauty. It's not as Spartan as Nelson Mandela's Robben Island cell, but on the other hand, it's not very luxurious either, is it? Helen, I think you've been there, and one or two others have been there. Margaret Bedggood comes quite frequently. It's a place to contemplate and take time. My final thought is that St Isaac's is dedicated to St Isaac of Nineveh. The Reverend Clementina Gordon, who founded the St Isaac's Retreat House Trust, was a woman who read the scriptures in Greek for the New Testament, Hebrew for the Old Testament, and Syriac for both. She loved the Syriac tradition of Christianity. She loved St Isaac of Nineveh. And the chapel and the retreat place is dedicated to St Isaac of Nineveh. In case you're wondering what the connection is, well, where is Nineveh? Nineveh are the plains in what is now Iraq, but what was then Syria, where the capital city is a place called Mosul. And so if you are praying this week, please pray for the people of Nineveh and for the traditions that come from St Isaac. That part of it was all Syria, but it got cut up by the British and French after the Great War. It was one of the most diverse ethnically, religiously, linguistically parts of the world. It's now in serious strife, and there is war going on there. But after the war, there will be peace. Sometime there will be peace. And who are going to be the people who bring it together? So, there we are. Do you think the wolves amongst you will feed with the lambs beside you? Do you think that there are any oxen in here who are prepared to put up with a lion trying to eat straw? It's a very crazy idea, isn't it? But there we are. That's what 3rd Isaiah suggested to us. That's what I think would be a good idea for us all to think about for this coming week. Praise and glory to God, and may my words resonate a little in your hearts, and if not, may you rest in your journeys this week in a thoughtful and prayerful way. Amen.